What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to a new video, and in today's video we're covering why the stack matters so much. It's one of the foundational concepts that I teach in my coaching. Whether I work with a beginner or a seasonal athlete, this is one of the first things that we try to integrate in the coaching. If you don't understand the stack, you don't understand human movement. It's the foundation for relative motion, and relative motion is key to perform pain-free in the long run. If we're missing relative motion, we are orientating. That means the whole structure is moving as a unit, and relative motion is exactly the opposite. Relative motion ensures that the bones and joints can move as they're supposed to. Now, let me make an example. An example for orientation would be when I raise the arm, that I move the ribcage as I raise the arm, right? Relative motion is the joint moving independently from the other structure. This concept is very important when we're talking about lower body movements, but it is important to understand that if we're missing relative motion, we are orientating. And if we're orientating, we're just pilling compensations on top of each other, and things might get worse in the long run. And the stack is our access point to relative motion. So if we are missing relative motion, the first thing that we should do is try to get access to the stack, because that will create some neutrality and give us more movement options again, so that the structures can actually work how they're supposed to, independently, in conjunction with each other. The stack entails a neutral position of the head, ribcage and pelvis. Ideally, those structures are aligned nicely on top of each other, and that creates well-distributed pressure within the body and well-distributed pressure through the body when there is load applied, like through axial loading, through a squat, dip, or anything similar. Now, the ribs and the pelvis are stacked with each other. They are parallel. Now, if they are off alignment, the pressure distribution will be off, right? So if we're overly flaring the ribs and we're arching the lower back, we bring the diaphragm and the pelvis out of alignment. And this then creates a not so optimal position for us to create and produce force. If we're starting with a bad stack, so out of alignment, like I just said, with some flared ribs and an extended lower back, the system will lock up and we're going to borrow some movement from elsewhere. That means when we are doing squats, we're probably moving through the lower back instead of the hips, or vice versa, simply because there is no relative movement at the SI joint or somewhere else. What actually is the stack? The stack is nothing else than a neutral position of the head, ribcage and pelvis. Those structures should be nicely aligned on top of each other above the base of support, so the mid of our foot. Now, if we're off alignment, like the ribcage is protruded forward or someone is presenting with rounded shoulders, then the center of mass is ever so slightly off that base of support, and our body tries to reorganize in space to be balanced above the midfoot. And that usually results in compensation long term. And the stack is the neutral position that we should be able to access whenever we need it. That's nothing that we need to hold throughout the exercise, but it is our starting position. And that's why it is so important that we are going to access it, because if it's our starting position and we're starting the movement with a compromised position already, how the hell are we supposed to improve the technique during the exercise, especially if there is load applied that pushes us into certain directions? So it is very, very hard to shift the body's center of mass in space to make everything work well without compensations. And something to keep in mind is that proximal alignment creates distal function. That means if the ribcage and the pelvis are nicely stacked with each other, nicely parallel, we give the body a lot of movement options. So the joints that are attached to the center of the body, so the spine, the ribcage, and the pelvis, they have a lot of access to movement options. If we're starting in a compromised form, they don't have much access to those movement options. And that's why the stack is so important. It gives us the ability to access movement and to distribute forces evenly. Now, that's one of the main things. The stack position helps us regulate pressure within the body and pressure that is applied onto the body. And therefore, especially when it's applied from the outside, we need to be able to resist those forces with internal pressure. And we cannot create internal pressure if the diaphragms are not stacked with each other. So this is key. That also means that we are starting with a bad stack position, the system will lock up. And when the system locks up, it kinda pretends that we have some movement options because the body is very smart in adapting and always finds the easiest and smartest way to access some movement, our so-called compensations. That's why we're shifting to a certain side when the squat gets heavy or dips and so on, because the body finds a way to get from A to B. But the issue starts if we're starting to load these patterns long term. And as I just said, then the forces are not distributed evenly into the body anymore, simply because we're off alignment and therefore we're just stressing the structures more than it is necessary. So to summarize why the stack is so important, there are a couple of points I like to go over. That is, respiration drives position. That means if we're presenting with a flared ribcage, the diaphragm is probably stuck in inhalation. That means the hip, the pelvis is tilted forward into an anterior tilt. That results in a loss of hip extension. Or, as we just covered, pressure and orientation. So that means the stack controls how force is distributed across the joints and the whole body. So if we're off alignment, those forces are distributed not so nicely into the body and we're pulling compensation on top of each other. And the last thing is movement options. So the stack gives us relative motion, and if we're not able to access the stack, we're likely to move through orientation, so the whole structure moving as a unit instead of those structures moving independently from each other within the bigger system. And that's also the reasons why I teach this first in my coaching. Whether you are a seasoned street lifter, power lifter, or you just want to get rid of pain, this is the first thing that you need to learn, because this creates a stable base on which we can build long term, because we're here for the long run and not for a couple of weeks, right? So this is going to be a step-by-step guide on how to access the stack. Now, for this exercise, I usually recommend my clients to start with a hip width stance. Feet pointed straight forward, and we have 3 points of contact. The inner heel, the inner ball of the big toe, without losing the ball of the pinky. Then, after applying foot pressure, having the pressure applied with both feet, the next step that we're going to do is we're going to bend the knees slightly. This is going to be very helpful for most people, especially for those presenting with an anterior tilt. Okay, if I'd be standing tall and I'd be presenting with that arched back, that slight bend in the knees could be sufficient to tuck the hips a little bit more under and to assume a more neutral position. Okay, so we don't expect a complete straight line because our spine is shaped like an S curve. So we have a little bit of lordosis, kyphosis, lordosis, and kyphosis. So there will be some natural rounding. And that is also something that we are going to implement within the next couple of steps. So the stack is not going to be 100% straight line. Now, after bending the knees, right, this is very important. We only want to bend them by about 5 to 10 degrees. Otherwise, we're going into too much hip flexion, tucking the hips too much under. Now, the next thing that we are going to do is to adjust the hip position, because as I mentioned, for some people it might not be sufficient to just bend the knees, and we need to adjust the pelvis position a little bit further to improve the stack position, especially if you're someone who tends to present with an arched back. The biggest issue for most people is that they try to assume a neutral lower back position with the help of their pelvis. But for most of them, it would be better to start at the ribcage, because the ribcage is also a structure that we can kind of lower and push back in space. And that is going to be very important, especially for the breathing part, because if we're arched, we cannot access those side abs, which are the muscles responsible for the breathing, and then also creating internal pressure when we're squatting, pressing, or pulling. Now, when we adjust the position of the hips, it's important that we kind of end up in a neutral position, and we want to avoid any extremes. So I don't want to be overly pushed forward, so the hip shouldn't be extended and it shouldn't be overly tucked. Right? And I don't want you to squeeze the glutes by any means. We always want to have a neutral position, not overly extended, not overly tucked. That's the most important thing. And as I just said, for most people, they actually should try to start at the ribcage rather than just tucking the hips under. So that could mean for you just to simply exhale. This will help to push the ribs back and down and stack it nicely with the core. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is that we are going to reach forward. Now, in this forward reach position, we want to protract the scaps. So we want to reach forward without losing height in the skeleton. So we don't want to do this and pin the sternum down. So we actually want to reach the arms forward, stay tall through the spine. And now you should see how my natural curvature has increased or it is more prominent now. And that really helps to put us into a position where we can actually create some proper tension. Now for me, since I tend to present with kind of this more so tucked under position, I need to be very careful on not overly tucking my hips too much in this position here. Now, and this is actually the stack position that we're trying to achieve. Head over ribcage, ribcage and head over pelvis. Okay. Now, in this position here, we could try to breathe like we did in the previous tutorials. That means we're aiming for a 4 to 8 seconds exhale, tensing the side abs at the very end of the exhale by breathing out rather than by tensing the muscles muscularly. We hold the tension on the side abs as we inhale and create tension. And it's very important that we don't use any extremes. So we don't want to overly round and we don't want to overly flare, because that compromises the position of the stack. So let's go through the final checkpoints one by one. We start with the foot pressure, inner heel, inner ball of the big toe. We don't lose outer ball of the pinky. Now we bend the knees 5 degrees. We position the hips by taking a deep exhale here. We reach the arms forward without losing height in the skeleton. And now we're ensuring that we're having the eyes at horizon, so the head is stacked nicely above the ribcage and the ribcage above the pelvis. And this is the position I really want you to ingrain, okay? This is what you need to remember, how it's supposed to feel, because as I mentioned initially, this is going to be the starting position for literally every movement that we're going to do. Now let's look at the stack in application to certain exercises. This is the goblet squat. And here we're trying to keep the center of mass close to our base of support. In this case, the mid-foot. But we can't reach the elbows too far forward because then we're throwing off our center of mass. And it would be too heavy as well. Now, we still can keep the center of mass relatively close to the torso while still protracting by pushing the elbows forward. That forward push is called an elbow reach, which creates protraction and keeps the center of mass close to our body's center of mass. Now, the main goal here with this exercise is to feel the initial foot contact, bend the knee slightly, exhale, position the hips, reach, and squat. The next exercise we're going to take a look at are hinges. As with the other exercises, we're starting the same way by feeling the foot pressure, bending the knee slightly, reaching the elbows forward, protracting the scaps, exhaling, inhaling, creating tension, and now it's getting a little bit more complicated. Now we need to hinge as we hold the reach. We bend our knees slightly, grab the bar, stand up by pushing the feet into the ground. And we come back down. We feel the foot point contact, inner ball of the big toe, inner heel, slight bend in the knees, exhale, reach, position the hips, inhale, hinge, squat, grip the bar, push the ground away. This is the hook lying press. Now, in a hook lying position, we're automatically assuming a nicely stacked position. As you can see, my head is in line with the ribcage and the pelvis. Now, we could assume this position also by using a box, right? Like I'm doing here now, or by elevating the feet with a bumper plate, yoga block, or anything similar, so that we can keep the lower back in contact. Now, you might have heard of the cue retracting the shoulder blades and puffing the chest up, and this is doing exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do, right? So we really want to keep the ribs down and not up, because when we extend the back, we are losing that stacked position, right? So for most people, it's gonna be the hook lying position that we're starting off. And now what we want to do here is we want to keep the space between the two shoulder blades in contact with the bench throughout the exercise, whilst keeping the chest up, okay? So what we're not doing is we're not extending and arching the back as we lower the dumbbells, and we really want to think of keeping the lower back and the upper back nicely in contact. But also here, we really want to avoid, we're not crunching too much by letting the head come off the bench, for example, or we also need to be very careful when pushing, right? So we want to get a slight reach here, but we don't want to do that reach, okay? Because that will then reach rounded shoulders, and that would just put us into another compensated position. This is the chest supported row, and this is also a great example of the stack, right? Because when I'm laying in this prone position, my head, my ribcage, and my pelvis are stacked with each other. For some people, it will kind of look like this here, okay? If that's you, then you might have to adjust the technique ever so slightly for this particular exercise. Then I really want you to almost crunch your side abs, but more so thinking about having the hips off the bench, okay? Because for you, you will kind of present with that arch back, and then just taking the hips off ever so slightly will be totally sufficient. Now with this exercise here, I really want you to keep the sternum proud, okay? What could happen is that when you're placing yourself too high on the bench, you will lose height in the skeleton. So what I try to use as a reference is kind of 3 to 4 centimeters below my clavicle. So I can get sufficient stretch without having to kind of protract too much and lose height in the skeleton. And as we row, we want to ensure we hold the stack position throughout. If you can't breathe, you don't own it. The stack is all about breathing, pressure, and movement, all tied together. Nail it and you open up your body. Miss it and you just reinforce this function. If you want to learn how to implement this in your training, then reach out for my one-on-one online coaching. The link is down in the description. If you need any help with the training or have questions, then just drop them down in the comments below. If you haven't done yet, please subscribe and share this video so you don't miss out on any new content. See you in the next one.